Hi everyone, McGregor Card here, and in this video we're going to be installing the motors and ESC. Now to do this we're going to need a lot more tools. We will need a 1.5mm hex driver, a 2mm hex driver, a pair of wire strippers, a pair of tweezers, our soldering iron, and solder. Then we'll also need conformal coating, some Loctite, and the hardware for the motors, and also the hardware to install the ESC. The motor hardware comes in the box with the motor. It comes with two different sets of screws, 3mm screws and 4mm screws. Now because these arms on the frame are a little bit thick, we're going to need the 4mm screws. So you can just put the 3mm screws aside. The hardware you're going to need to install the ESC onto the frame is going to be 4 M2 by 18 screws, 4 M2 plastic nuts, 4 rubber vibration dampeners, and 4 M2 standoffs. Now in the hardware kit, there are two different sizes of these plastic standoffs. There's some that are a little bit taller and some that are shorter. You'll need the shorter ones to go on the top of the ESC. To start off, we're going to prepare and solder on the XT60 pigtail onto the ESC. To do this, we'll need to get our XT60 pigtail. You can cut off just about an inch. Doesn't have to be precise, about an inch to an inch and a quarter of length. And using your wire strippers, you want to cut off about 3/16 of the insulation. Now go ahead and give these wires a little bit of a twist to help keep the strands together. Then you're going to need to turn on your soldering iron and let it warm up. Now since you're going to be soldering some heavier gauge wire, you want to set your soldering iron to around 400 degrees Celsius. Now the first thing we're going to need to do is clean the tip. To do this, you can use a wet sponge, or in this case I'm using some wet paper towels. So you just want to wipe off the tip to make sure it's clean. Next, you're going to want to tin the power wires. Tinning the power wires means we put solder into the strands of the wire. Doing this will make soldering the wires onto the ESC easier. So to tin the wires, you want to get your solder, make sure your tip is clean, place the soldering iron onto the wire and put a little bit of solder on the tip so that solder starts to flow into the end of the wire. Now since this is heavier gauge wire, you're going to want to keep the soldering iron on the wire until you can see that the solder is flowing into the strands. Now it's okay if you get a little bit of a blob like this. You just want to make sure that the solder gets in all the strands all the way around. And to get rid of the excess solder, here's a little trick that you can do. You put the wire on the tip of the soldering iron, put a little bit of pressure on the wire, and then just give it a little flick. Then you're left with a nice tinned wire with not too much solder left over. Go ahead and do this on both the red and black wires. Be sure to clean your tip often to get the most amount of heat transfer from your soldering iron. As you're tinning, you'll want to keep adding small amounts of solder to help keep the solder flowing. And remember, it's okay if you get a little bit of a blob, because we can do the little trick to flick it off. Once you've tinned the wires, it should look something like this. Now that we've pre-tinned the wires, we're going to pre-tin the pads on the ESC. To do this, we get our soldering iron, make sure the tip is clean, get your solder, and place the solder on top of the pad, and then place the soldering iron on top of the solder. And hold it there and add small amounts of solder until you're left with a nice little concave puddle of solder. Do this on both the positive and negative terminals. On the negative terminal, it'll take a little bit extra time for it to heat up because there's a lot of copper underneath the negative side of the terminal. Once you're done tinning the pads, it should look something like this. Now we can go ahead and solder the power wires onto the ESC. To do this, get your soldering iron, and again, make sure your tip is clean. And I like to add just a little bit of solder to the soldering iron tip to help with heat transfer. So place the red wire on top of the positive side and place the soldering iron on top of the wire. Hold it there until it gets hot enough that it melts the solder underneath on the pad. You can sometimes give it a little bit of a wiggle while watching the solder underneath to make sure that it's melting. Once it's on, remove the heat and try to hold the joint as still as possible until the solder is solidified. You may find that you need to add a little bit extra solder to the joint, so go ahead and put the iron back on and just add in a tiny amount of solder so that you're left with a solder joint that looks something like this. Go ahead and do the same for the negative side. Get your soldering iron, clean the tip, place a little bit of solder on the soldering iron tip, and solder on the black wire. Now remember, it's going to take a little bit extra time to get the solder to melt on the negative side. So just keep a close eye on it and watch until you can see that the solder underneath the wire is melted. Go ahead and add a little bit extra solder if you need to. Try to hold the wire steady in place and remove the heat. When you're done, you should have a solder joint that looks something like this. Things to watch out for when soldering these wires on is you don't want any solder from the positive side to touch these capacitors right here. That will cause a short that can possibly damage the ESC. So try to be careful and keep the solder contained to only the positive and negative terminals. Now the next step is an optional step, but it's one that we highly recommend. It's using silicone conformal coating to coat the electronics on the ESC. To do this, you want to make sure the board is cooled off from when you were soldering it. Open your conformal coating and then carefully just brush it on. While doing this, you want to take special care to not get conformal coating inside this connector. If you get conformal coating in this connector, it will need to be cleaned out. Otherwise, the connector will not make a good connection. It's okay to get conformal coating on the back of the connector, just not on the inside. You can coat the positive and negative wires, but try not to get conformal coating on these 12 pads you see on the sides. We will be connecting the motors to those pads later. It's okay if you do get conformal coating on these pads because a soldering iron can burn through it. What conformal coating does is helps prevent moisture or water from shorting out components on the board. If flying in an area that has damp grass or flying in the winter when you might crash in the snow, you want your electronics protected against moisture. Using this conformal coating puts a layer of silicone on the parts and helps keep them protected from moisture. Try to coat any and all parts on all sides. When you're done, it should look something like this. You'll want to see conformal coating covering all the little pins on the chips and covering all the little components on both sides. Now I'll want to set this aside and let it dry for 25 to 30 minutes. While waiting for the conformal coating to dry on the ESC, we can go ahead and install the rubber dampeners and the motors. To install the rubber dampeners, you'll need to put the fat side down through each of these holes. To do this, it's good if you get some tweezers and pinch the dampeners to help them go through the hole. If you want, you can also use one of your hex drivers to help push it down through. Try and be careful not to tear or rip the rubber dampeners as you're installing them. Go ahead and put the other 3 in. The rubber dampeners help to isolate the flight controller from high frequency vibrations while flying. This helps reduce vibration and improve performance on the flight controller. Alright, once we've got the rubber dampeners installed, we can go ahead and mount the motors. If you got the Emax Pulsar motors, they come with 3 different plastic covers. You can go ahead and choose whichever color you want. Just for fun, we're going to use blue on this installation. Place the cover on the bottom of the motor. Then get out your 4mm screws. Now, one important thing to note is that the motors on a drone can produce a lot of vibration, and that vibration can cause the motor screws to loosen over time. So to help prevent that from happening, we will put some Loctite on the threads of the motor screws. We recommend using blue strength Loctite because it helps stop the screws from loosening over time, yet still lets you remove the screws if you need to replace a motor. Now, the best way I've found to apply Loctite is to get the screw, put it on the end of the hex driver, and then simply apply a little bit of Loctite to the tip of the screw. Then get your motor and line it up with the screw. Then start it into the motor. You want to make sure that the motor wires are parallel with the arm and point towards the center. Now don't tighten this screw, leave it a little bit loose so that you can line up the holes for the rest of the screws. Go ahead and put Loctite on each screw as you put it in. Now repeat this process for all 4 motors. Put your plastic guard on. Get your motor screws. And apply the Loctite. Place a screw in the arm and line up the holes. Then start the screw into the motor. Place your plastic cover. And Loctite your screws. Now when you're doing this, you can go ahead and tighten the motor screws down if you want. Personally, I like to wait until I have all the screws in the motors before I tighten them down. When you're done, you'll have 4 screws left over. They usually send you extra screws in case you lose one. Now that all the motor's on, I'm going to go ahead and tighten all the motor screws. You want to get them tight, but don't want to over tighten because the bottom of the motors are aluminum and they can strip. Try to make sure that the hex driver is fully inserted in the screw so you don't strip the head of the screw. If you do, try to remove that screw and use one of the spares. It's a good idea to go through and make sure all the screws are tight. You don't want screws falling out while you're flying. Alright, now that we've got the motors installed, I like to take the prop nuts and thread them onto the motor shafts, just to keep them from getting lost or misplaced. Now note that there is extra hardware in the baggie with the prop nuts. If you want, you can consolidate these down into one baggie. You want to save them just in case. If you need to replace a bell on the motors, you will need that hardware to take the screw off the bottom of the motor to release the motor bell housing. Alright, if it's been 25 to 30 minutes, the conformal coating on the speed controller should be dry. So we'll go ahead and install that now. To do this, we'll take the 4 2mm by 19 screws and put them through the bottom in the rubber dampeners. Then we'll take our 4 2mm plastic nuts and thread them onto these screws. You You might want to use your 1.5 millimeter hex driver to make the process easier. Now don't tighten these down too tight. You want there to be a little bit of play in the screw. This will help eliminate those high frequency vibrations from getting to the flight controller. Alright, once we've got those screws and nuts in place, we can go ahead and set our ESC onto those screws. You'll want the power wires to come out of the right side. Now with the speed controller in place, use these smaller hex standoffs and screw these down onto the ESC to secure it. You might need to use your 1.5 millimeter hex driver to hold the screws in place. Now just get these finger tight because they are made out of plastic and can strip if you over tighten them. Alright, now that we've got the ESC installed, we can go ahead and start soldering on our motor wires. But before we do that, I like to zip tie the motor wires down to the arms so that they'll stay in place while we're soldering them. So go ahead and get 4 zip ties and zip tie each of the sets of motor wires down to each arm. I like to lay the wires out nice and even before zip tying them. Go ahead and clip off the excess from the zip tie. And repeat this on all 4 arms. Please note that on the back 2 motors, the wires are going to need to go around the inside of this post. If they go around the outside, when you place the canopy on, the wires will get pinched. For this next part, we're going to be soldering the wires onto the ESC. You'll notice that the ESC has these 3 pads on all 4 corners. These are the pads that the motor wires will solder to. I like to lay the wire out in place where I'm going to solder it to before I cut it to length. And something to remember is on these back motors, you'll need to route the wires going around this post so that they don't get pinched when you put the canopy down. Go ahead and cut your first wire so that there will be just enough length so that after you strip it, you'll end up right in the middle of that pad, like so. Do this with all 3 wires first, and then we will strip and solder them. Now that all 3 wires are trimmed, get your wire strippers and using the 20 gauge hole, strip off about 1/8 of an inch of insulation off the end of each wire. Now with the wires stripped, you will want to pre-tin the wires and the pads before we solder them. So get your soldering iron, clean the tip, and tin the wires much like you tin the power wires. But because these wires are a smaller gauge, it won't take as much to get them tinned. Tin the wires like that, and then tin the pads on the ESC. You'll want just a good little bead of solder on each of the pads. Then you get your tweezers and hold the wire in place while soldering it. It's a good idea to kind of give the wire a little bend so that when you hold it in place, it sticks straight up to where it needs to go. Then with this clean solder tip, try to touch the tip to both the wire and the pad at the same time. And hold the wire in place until the solder is solidified. Do this with each of the wires. Sometimes you might get a little spike of solder jutting up or out from the sides. To fix this, clean your solder tip, then heat up the joint and apply just a small amount of solder. When you're done, it should look something like this. Now things to watch out for are if you get solder bridges in between these contacts. You want to make sure that there's no solder in between them because that will cause a short and will burn out the ESC. Now go ahead and repeat this step on all 3 other motors, keeping in mind that on the back motors you'll need to route the wires around this post. your wire into place and then cut it to length. Then using the 20 gauge hole on your strippers, strip the 1/8 of insulation off. Then tin your wires and the pads. Then, using your tweezers, go ahead and hold the wires in place and solder them down. Remember to try to heat up the wire and the pad simultaneously. If you need to, add a little bit extra solder to the joint to make sure it looks good. When you're done, it should look like that. On the front wires, just route them much like the back wires. Make sure they go around behind the FPV camera mount. If you can't get the cutters in there, you can mark the wire by pinching it with the tweezers and making a mark on the jacket of the wire. And you can see your mark and know where to cut it. Go ahead and do this for the rest of the wires. Alright, make sure you check for any shorts or solder bridges and touch it up if necessary. And when you're done, it should look something like this. Now at this point, we can go ahead and route the power wires over and around like this. And then using a zip tie, we'll zip tie the wires down through these two holes. Go ahead and cut off the excess. And now we're ready to start installing the rest of the components. So join us in the next video for that. And if you have any questions, please let us know, and have fun flying.